Here are some thoughts on the endings of two high intensity role playing experiences. One using the old systems for the very old rule set for RuneQuest from the late 70s, played with Spelens Hus, and then the other using Champions Now, played with two of my friends who live in Göteborg. So both this is Swedish role playing, right? Big time. Well, um, where to go? First of all, they were both highly positive experiences for me. Very affirming in terms of enjoying the medium and playing with people long term that I haven't played with long term before, and in some cases, people I haven't played with or hardly at all before. So all of those are great things, right? You're not looking at the tried and true, group that's been around for decades with their skills and their flashy performances, honed for the cameras or anything like that. This is, the real deal. So that's great, and this could be a very celebratory video, except that in both cases, um, the ending was I'm not going to say ruined. The endings were very, very flawed, and the responsibility is solely mine. And I want to talk a little bit about how this happened and what we can think about in terms of endings. I've written a lot about endings. A lot of my games have endings. A lot of them don't, but talk about how you might arrive at an ending. And that last section last concept is the most important for this talk, because neither of these games has a designated end game or arc system or anything of the kind. And so I want to talk about play in which one is aware that one has, or the group has actually made its ending. And it's not really a matter of planning for it, campaigning toward it, setting it up, or anything of the kind. It is instead a discovery. And the essence of that, of course, is that you don't plan for it, so you don't know when it's going to end. The important thing is not to keep going after it has ended. And so the very concept of, well, how do I set up my endings? How do you do endings, in role playing, is a borked question from the beginning. We're talking about some other way of managing that concept rather than how do we, do it in terms of engineering. So, first and foremost, let's take this model that if you do have kind of the engineering model, then the question is, well, do you go to a crash landing or do you go to a controlled landing? And there's actually positive versions of the crash landing, as well as negative ones. And then the controlled landing, I tend to be less sympathetic toward, but is also, I think you could say, there are at least positive versions of it as well as negative ones. But I'm saying that I'm off that whole plane. We aren't talking about whether the landing is controlled or uncontrolled going in. I'm talking about saying, huh, we landed. Oh, holy cow. Well, that's ideally what should occur with both Champions Now and with, in my opinion, a long-running fantasy adventure, sequence such as you find in that version of RuneQuest. Um, Note as well that the RuneQuest game in particular was not constructed using various critical personal arc-based conflicts built into or even generated through play for given characters. Some such things did start to occur and became, I think, a nice, powerful piece of the rhythm section of play, but they were not in and of itself, spotlighting, saying, "Oh, now it's time to deal with, his or her crisis about this." So they're slightly harder mechanics like the kicker and sorcerer, and even harder mechanics, things like, what is my character's, prevailing issue and stuff like that. There's nothing of the sort in either game. Well, anyways, so what happened? Why didn't we just discover our endings? And there are a couple of things. In Spelens Hus, my goal is not to have one core group that plays one core game, as its thing, um, but instead to be available for a wider range of people for whatever range of games, might be interesting to us. Me in particular, but us in general as we get to know more and more and more people. And so this game, basically, socially speaking, professionally speaking, because this is my job as Adept Play, was basically, had overgrown itself with the addition of um, the impact of COVID-19 on Sweden. I was not in a position to continue with what I had planned, which was to expand my presence there, so that I was there for another evening, which was specifically dedicated to pick up play with whoever, short term, and therefore we would be kind of allowed, or my sense of being appropriate would be met, to continue playing with another group in long term until such a time as we discover our ending. And that was gone. I mean, I was also planning on being in Spelens Hus a lot more during the day throughout the week, and perhaps setting up groups and playtimes and stuff like that then. Well, all of that's just scuttled. All of that was just gone. So here I was with, one group and a screen. Very difficult to advertise the availability for play, um, even through, the social mechanisms of Spelens Hus. Really, it's not working out to promote and attract people to play, in the present day. So I'm really waiting for that death rate to flatten completely, for a designated time in my head, and then I'll start going to Spelens Hus again. But anyway, there I was, kind of saying, wow, we are really working this game, but I am actually watching my professional goals kind of, through no real fault of this game or anyone in it. It's all I've got, and it's not supposed to be all I've got. And if I'm going to be stuck with this medium, then I'm going to need to close this. So that was the artificial constraint. Champions Now was a little bit similar in that all of us are, really carving out the time for this. And the goal was to, enjoy a bit of Champions Now so that Ulf and Ola could kind of see it. And the game, however, is built to enrich, just enrich, 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 in its content. And so you get sort of an increase in valuable material, building up, building up, building up into almost as these different levels of critical mass and hotspots. Um, and then those hotspots are what you play as you go. And in the case of this game, the serial nature of comics therefore becomes, emergent. You find yourself doing it, and there's always more to do, and there's stuff going on, and the character is more interesting as you go. I mean, because the game is also built to do that. There's a sense of, development there in a mechanical sense that I don't think you can find anywhere else, which is very exciting. So the point is that, we might want to say, hey, we're going to play for a few sessions, whatever. And the game, if you're doing it, will kind of say, no, you're not. The game says, I am built to do something else. And, although Alan Moore did not invent this phrase with Rorschach, that's where most people who are watching this will have encountered it, which is, I'm not locked up in here with you, you're locked up in here with me, and that's kind of the way Champions Now looks at you. So here I was looking at a particularly rich and bountiful set of things for our now, and realizing that I was going to have to close a lot of it quick. We just didn't have the time. We didn't have the energy. We had not socially invested in that kind of interaction. Um, and so I basically um, betrayed the design of the game. Um, and in a couple of ways, that artificiality had two opposite effects in the games. Or rather, an effect in one game, which is the opposite of the effect in the other. And in the case of RuneQuest, it was basically over, um, if not non-mechanically, then in a couple of cases, amechanically, um, and very quickly, so that that final session was only, you know, it's a very short session, and also the rolls being made started to actually have less and less in terms of consequence going on in terms of what a failure would mean. For example, in some ways, we might have closed just before that session, and simply, I could have just said, okay, and that happened. To play it out was visually sort of fun, except that again, it was kind of me talking a lot. But it was also, where I would say, okay, well, let's roll for this, and I'm thinking to myself, well, wait a minute, we're closing it out. What's happened has happened. What are we rolling for? What does this mean? And I don't really think I managed it very well. I didn't have a clear view of those things. The system has its own very specific things about what you roll for, and then there's a somewhat flexible set of principles by which you can apply the existing mechanics to other things that aren't known or predicted in a rule book. But above that or beyond that, at the level of the kind of cosmic happenings and significances, and whether your body gets dissolved through the ether, to become part of nature from now on, or whether you become a demigod or something, all of that's very well handled in later iterations of games set in Glorantha, and to some extent, the mechanics sets that they're built on, but not in that set. And I really was not quite able to wrap my head around how are we going to do that in some way that I consider to be honoring mechanics of play. In other words, we do things with these dice and stuff that we then use as a bouncy mechanism to continue to play. And I just don't think I did that, or we did that. And so I look at the events of play and I'm going, oh, this is just basically a guy talking, where people are doing things, and then the guy talking says, well, and that would mean this, and it's not very satisfying in terms of honoring how we had been playing and how that would itself have the integrity due to events of an ending. Again, probably the solution in RuneQuest might not have been to play that final bit, and just let us imagine it in kind of one of those, those endings that drives everybody insane of, but what happened? It was very glowy, but what? Maybe better. Who knows? Now, as for the champions now, the opposite, as I say, applies. Instead of sort of an quickly finished off and not particularly mechanically sound or understood set of what are we doing these dice for kind of thing. Instead, we have this monster session that just would not quit, and all of us, me especially, I'll just say it, way over the day when I want to be up until the wee hours, playing the role-playing game. And you can even see the one moment when it's just clear as day, when I literally say, guys, I am getting loopy, I'm not following what I'm doing, and not sure, losing track of stuff. And then I go ahead and say, but I want to finish this. There, right there. Somebody should have stopped me. And said, yeah, we planned to finish with session 6, and now we're doing session 7, and too bad, it's going to be an 8. And instead, I was just in my momentum of saying, well, I'm already pushing my luck with everything by moving it into a 7, and that, however, was not speaking from the integrity of the fiction whatsoever. So what was the effect of this? The effect of this was to continue to use the mechanics of play, but badly. Watching the recording as I edit has actually been really, my jaw's dropping. It's like the guy up until that point is actually using the system really nicely. All of us are. And then the guy after that point doesn't know how to play. It's really terrible. It particularly showed up in terms of the villains in question. The activities, the presence, the personalities of Huiva, Slice, and Hellbender were really rocking, in my opinion. Both as to play, watching the players engage with them, and I was really looking forward to the real powerhouse of the bunch, Stench, who's really, this is classic. He's the assassin of Hafsmannen's parents. He's the ideological, flag bearer of a noxious ideology. It's great. I'm thinking, well, it wasn't. And why? Because there's Hafsmannen taking a recovery, and before his next phase of action occurs, there's Stench punching him. And when you're taking a recovery, your defenses drop. And in Champions Now, whatever maneuvers and stuff you were doing, those numbers hold until your next phase begins. That's really important. It's not for a flicker of time when you have this plus and this minus for offense and defense. It's going to hold. You've set yourself up in that intervening period, and that's a big deal in this game. And Stench was, timing his hit beautifully, coming in on the recovering opponent, and the roll that he had was more than sufficient to clock Hafsmannen. And I missed because I was thinking of the full defenses. It was only by 1 point too, so the deal is that I'm like, wow, okay, so we're starting off, with that. Now, I don't care if a villain of mine, misses a hit. What I mind is when I misplay, and therefore the villain's effectiveness, the adversarial effectiveness, is just drained. And if you're up against a non-worthy antagonist, your excitement disappears. And I fancy that I can actually see Ulf's excitement kind of start to drain. I screw up some timing. Pretty sure I skipped one of Ulf's actions, so he had to go through a second round of Cosmonauts' really complicated interplay of ego-based and presence-based attacks, which we actually kind of really beefed into and are starting to understand about some cool stuff about those things, that involuntary telepathy that he has, and it all plays into it in Cosmonauts' sort of psychic, psychedelic, sympathetic attack, where he is, as he says, I am helping. I am going to free you. You need to be found. I will find you. Was just turning into a thing of beauty, but it is mechanically a little bit crisscrossing effects, and poor Ulf has to sit there through a second one of these without having been able to do anything. And I'm counting on my fingers as I'm watching the video and saying, wait a minute, didn't we skip him? So there's that. And then there's also the point when he punches Stench. And at that point, I should have had Stench's stinky aura affect him, just like it had affected Cosmonaut. So what we're seeing really is that Hafsmannen wasn't taking damage and wasn't, and had been skipped a little bit, so he's kind of Ulf's jonesing for his chance to hit the guy, as he said outright, and yet the opponent's not worthy. The effects So taking Stench down was too easy. Effectively, he went, and I even was so tired at that point. I'm even kind of almost playing my NPCs as kind of going, they're not even very impressed with Hellbender and Slice, and so I was trying to rack it up by trying to narrate it more excitingly, and I'm thinking, why am I having to do this? This guy is horrific. Why, you know, and it's why I'm looking through it and I've just blown the mechanics whatsoever. Even if we had continued to play through that combat, if I had managed the numbers properly, then I think it could have been a real nice blowout. And it certainly wouldn't have turned out quite the same. Um, but where there's no way on earth that I had or any of us had any energy for was the real climax, which was Groan Sikten, Greyface, actually making a choice, and our heroes making a choice about whether to put up with one another long enough to deal with the future, this other group, um, and what that could mean, in terms of Cosmonaut and Groan Sikten actually, communicating at last. That was session worthy. And so, no matter what, I should have clipped. Someone should have stopped me. We should have clipped it right when I acknowledged that I was, graying out. And the only reason, again, was that artificial constraint of, oh, we're supposed to finish now. So that's the enemy. In games of this kind, endings are things of beauty. I've been through them, and they are gorgeous. Truly a remarkable experience to have realize that you have come to the ending and you've played it. You've played most of it. There might be a bit left where we've got to nail this part down. How's that going to go? And stuff like that. But really, the sense of truly aesthetic, creative completion is, in my opinion, one of the great glories of this activity. And as soon as you pull in the secondary or the actually more, real effects of social expectations of when to finish and social needs of when to finish, and anything of that kind. Um, it's monstrous. It's monstrous. You've betrayed, ruined what you're doing. So I feel bad. I was really hoping that this was going to showcase quite a few things, and I think they did, but they didn't showcase that.